There are still a lot of questions around how a plane linked to Russian warlord Prigozhin ended up in a field in a ball of flames.
The morning of August 23rd, 2023, dawned gray and unremarkable over Moscow. For most Russians, it was just another Wednesday. But for Yevgeny Prigozhin, the 62-year-old founder of the Wagner Group mercenary army, it would be his last day on Earth. As he went about his routine that morning, nothing suggested that within 24 hours, his private jet would plummet from the sky in a fiery explosion that would end one of the most dramatic chapters in modern Russian history. 2 months earlier, Prigozhin had committed what many considered the unthinkable. He had challenged Vladimir Putin directly. On June 23rd, he had led his Wagner forces in an armed rebellion that shook the foundations of the Russian state. His mercenaries, battle-hardened from their brutal campaigns in Ukraine, had marched from their base in Rostov-on-Don toward Moscow itself. For 24 hours, the world watched as Putin's grip on power appeared to falter. Then, as suddenly as it began, the mutiny ended. Prigozhin called off his march, accepted exile to Belarus, and seemed to vanish from the public eye. But exile, as history has shown, is rarely permanent for men like Prigozhin, and forgiveness, in Putin's Russia, is often a luxury reserved for those who have never truly threatened the throne. Just one day before that fateful Wednesday, in the scorching heat of an African desert, somewhere in the vast expanse of the continent where Wagner Group mercenaries had carved out their shadowy empire, Prigozhin had stood before camera for what would be his final public appearance. Dressed in full camouflage, an assault rifle in his hands, the man who had risen from prison cook to oligarch to warlord delivered a recruitment pitch that would prove to be his last words to the world. "We are making Russia even greater on all continents," Prigozhin declared, his weathered face partially concealed by the desert sun's harsh glare. Behind him, the endless dunes stretched toward a horizon that seemed to mock the finite nature of human ambition. The video, posted on pro-Wagner Telegram channels, showed a man who appeared utterly unconcerned about his safety, a fatal miscalculation that would cost him everything within hours. This was Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man who had dared to challenge Vladimir Putin's war machine and lived to tell about it. For exactly 2 months. The so-called Putin's chef had transformed himself from a convicted thief and prison cook into one of Russia's most powerful and dangerous men, only to discover that in Putin's Russia there are lines you simply cannot cross and survive.
Caught on camera, unverified footage of the plane tumbling from the sky with a missing wing, then bursting into flames north of Moscow.
The path that led Prigozhin to that remote African desert began decades earlier in the gritty streets of Leningrad, where young Yevgeny learned that survival meant bending rules, breaking bones, and never showing weakness. Born in 1961 to a middle-class family, he seemed destined for an ordinary Soviet life until he chose crime over conformity. By his 20s, he was running protection rackets, robbing teenagers, and earning a reputation as someone willing to do whatever it took to get ahead. Prison came in 1981, 9 years behind bars for robbery, fraud, and involving minors in criminal activity. But prison, rather than breaking him, forged him into something harder. He emerged in 1990 into a Russia where the old rules were crumbling and fortunes could be made by those bold enough to seize them. Prigozhin opened a hot dog stand, then a restaurant, then a catering empire. When Putin rose to power, Prigozhin was there, serving elegant meals at state functions, earning the nickname Putin's chef. But catering was never enough for a man with Prigozhin's appetites. As Putin's wars grew bloodier and more expensive, Prigozhin saw opportunity in chaos. The Wagner Group, officially a private military company, but functionally an extension of the Kremlin's shadow operations, became his vehicle to power. Named after the call sign of Dmitry Utkin, a former special forces officer, Wagner deployed wherever Putin needed plausible deniability: Syria, Libya, the Central African Republic, Mali, and eventually Ukraine. For years, the arrangement worked perfectly. Putin got his off-the-books military force, Prigozhin got lucrative government contracts and protection from prosecution, and Wagner's mercenaries got to wage war without the constraints of official military command. They recruited heavily from Russian prisons, offering convicts a chance at redemption through violence, or at least a path out of their cells. But success bred ambition, and ambition bred conflict. As Wagner's influence grew, so did Prigozhin's ego and his willingness to challenge authority. The turning point came in Ukraine, where Wagner forces found themselves locked in a grinding, bloody battle for the city of Bakhmut. Prigozhin watched his men die by the thousands, while, in his view, Russian military leadership provided inadequate support and supplies. His frustration exploded into public view through a series of increasingly unhinged videos and audio messages. Prigozhin accused Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov of incompetence, corruption, and deliberately undermining Wagner operations. He claimed they were starving his forces of ammunition, using Wagner troops as cannon fodder and pursuing a war strategy doomed to failure. The breaking point came on June 23, 2023, exactly 2 months before his death. In a dramatic audio message that would seal his fate, Prigozhin accused Russian military leadership of lying about the justifications for the Ukraine invasion.
The war was needed not in order to return Russian citizens to our bosom, and not in order to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. It was needed for one star with additional embroidery, so that one mentally sick man could look good on a coffin pillow.
He claimed the war was not about protecting ethnic Russians or preventing NATO expansion, but about enriching oligarchs and satisfying the ego of military commanders. "We have come to the border with Ukraine," Prigozhin declared in that fateful recording. The regular army fled. The Wagner units went to the front and started fighting, but it turned out that the evil, the deceit, the bureaucratic mayhem that dominates the country has reached its maximum in the Ministry of Defense. What followed was unprecedented in Putin's Russia, an armed rebellion. Wagner forces, thousands strong, began their march on Moscow. They seized the military headquarters in Rostov-on-Don, shooting down Russian aircraft and advancing toward the capital with barely any resistance. For a few terrifying hours, it seemed possible that a former convict and his army of mercenaries might actually topple Putin's regime. But Prigozhin's nerve failed at the crucial moment. Whether through Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko's mediation or Putin's threats, the march on Moscow halted just 200 kilometers from the Kremlin. Prigozhin ordered his forces to return to their bases to avoid bloodshed. In exchange, he was promised exile in Belarus and amnesty for his fighters. It was a deal with the devil, and Prigozhin should have known better. In Putin's Russia, challenges to absolute authority are never truly forgiven, only temporarily deferred. The Wagner rebellion had humiliated Putin on the world stage, exposed the weakness of his military leadership, and demonstrated that even his most trusted allies could turn against him. Such transgressions demand blood. For 2 months, Prigozhin lived in a strange limbo. Officially exiled to Belarus, he seemed to move freely between Africa and Russia, continuing to manage Wagner operations while maintaining a lower profile. His social media presence, once prolific with bellicose videos and inflammatory statements, went largely quiet. Perhaps he believed he had successfully navigated the storm, that his value to Putin's African operations would protect him from retribution. He was wrong. The video from August 22nd told a different story. Standing in that African desert, Prigozhin appeared confident, even defiant. "We are looking for those who can become part of our family," he said, addressing potential Wagner recruits. those who are ready to protect the interests of our country, to protect the interests of our people, to protect the interests of justice on the African continent. But beneath the bravado, those who knew him detected signs of strain. He looked older, more weathered than in his previous appearances. His eyes, always calculating, carried a wariness that suggested he understood his position remained precarious. Still, he was recruiting new fighters, planning future operations, apparently convinced he still had a future to plan for. That evening, as night fell over the African desert, Prigozhin made his final preparations. Intelligence sources would later suggest he had been increasingly paranoid about his security, varying his travel routes and schedules, using multiple aircraft and decoy movements. But eventually, every fugitive must trust someone, and someone always betrays that trust. The decision to return to Russia on August 23rd remains mysterious. Some reports suggest he was summoned for a meeting, others that it was a routine business trip. What is certain is that he boarded his Embraer Legacy 600 business jet at an airport outside Moscow, bound for St. Petersburg. With him were 9 others, including his longtime deputy Dmitry Utkin, Wagner's logistics chief Valery Chekolov, 4 bodyguards, and 3 crew members. The passenger manifest read like a who's who of Wagner leadership. Utkin, the former GRU officer whose call sign gave the organization its name, had been Prigozhin's right hand for years. Chekolov had managed Wagner's complex web of financial arrangements and African operations. These were not random passengers. They were the core of Wagner's command structure, all conveniently gathered in one aircraft. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Prigozhin made what would be his final phone calls. He spoke briefly with business associates about African mining operations, discussed logistics for Wagner deployments, and assured contacts that he would be back in touch soon. His voice, according to those who heard it, was calm and businesslike. If he suspected what was coming, he gave no sign. The Embraer lifted off into a clear August evening, climbing smoothly toward its cruising altitude. For the first few minutes of flight, everything appeared normal. The aircraft followed its filed flight plan, maintaining routine communication with air traffic controllers. Prigozhin settled into his seat, perhaps reviewing documents or planning his next moves in the chess game of African geopolitics that had become his specialty. But somewhere over the forests of Tver Oblast, approximately 100 kilometers north of Moscow, the game ended. At 6:11 p.m. local time, the aircraft's transponder signal vanished from radar screens. There was no distress call, no emergency declaration, no final words from the cockpit. One moment, the jet was cruising normally at 28,000 feet. The next, it was falling from the sky in pieces. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing the aircraft in an unusual attitude, appearing to flutter or spin as it descended. Some heard explosions before the impact. The plane struck the earth near the village of Kuzhen, Kini, with tremendous force, creating a crater and scattering debris across a wide area. All 10 people aboard were killed instantly. Within minutes, emergency responders were racing to the crash site, but there was nothing to rescue, only wreckage to examine and bodies to recover. The Embraer, once a symbol of luxury and power, was reduced to twisted metal and ash. Among the debris, investigators would later find what they described as fragments of hand grenades, though they claimed these came from the victim's belongings rather than an explosive device. In Moscow, the news spread with lightning speed through the corridors of power. Putin was informed within the hour, receiving the report with what aides described as stoic calm. There would be no immediate statement, no expression of shock or sorrow. In Putin's Russia, some deaths are simply facts to be acknowledged, not tragedies to be mourned. The official investigation would eventually conclude that the crash resulted from an explosion aboard the aircraft, though they would never specify the exact cause. U.S. intelligence officials, speaking anonymously, told reporters they believed a bomb had been placed on the plane, possibly in the landing gear compartment where it would not be detected during routine security checks. But the truth was already clear to anyone who understood how Putin's Russia operates. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man who had dared to march on Moscow, who had challenged the Kremlin's military leadership, who had exposed the lies and corruption at the heart of Putin's war machine, had paid the ultimate price for his defiance. His death sent a clear message to anyone else who might consider following his path. In Putin's Russia, loyalty is not a contract, but a one-way commitment. Betray that loyalty, and no amount of prior service, no network of connections, no geographic distance can protect you from the consequences. For Wagner fighters scattered across Africa and Belarus, the message was equally clear. Their patron was gone. Some would attempt to continue operations under new leadership, but the age of Wagner as an independent force had ended with the crash in Tver Oblast. Prigozhin's body was eventually recovered and identified through DNA testing, officially confirming what everyone already knew. He was buried quietly, without the fanfare that might have attended the funeral of a man who had once commanded thousands of mercenaries and wielded influence from Syria to Sudan. In his final 24 hours, Yevgeny Prigozhin had remained true to his nature, calculating, ambitious, convinced of his own invincibility right up to the moment when that conviction killed him. Standing in that African desert, rifle in hand, he had projected strength and confidence to the very end. Perhaps he genuinely believed he could outlast Putin's anger, that his usefulness would ultimately protect him. Or perhaps, in some corner of his mind, he knew the end was coming and chose to face it on his own terms, projecting power even as power was being stripped away from him. Either way, he had misjudged the fundamental nature of his relationship with Putin, not a partnership between equals, but a master-servant dynamic, where the servant serves only at the master's pleasure. The man who had risen from prison cook to Wagner warlord, who had commanded armies and toppled governments, who had dared to challenge Putin himself, met his end not in glorious battle, but in the sterile violence of an aircraft explosion. It was a fitting conclusion to a life lived in the shadows, where loyalty was currency and betrayal was death. In the end, Yevgeny Prigozhin discovered what many before him had learned too late. In Putin's Russia, there is no retirement from the game of power, only victory or elimination. And on August 23, 2023, exactly 2 months after his failed march on Moscow, Yevgeny Prigozhin was definitively eliminated. His Wagner empire would fracture and fade, his African operations would be absorbed by other entities, and his name would become a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of the Kremlin. But for 24 hours, in August 2023, Yevgeny Prigozhin had still believed he could beat the system that created him. That belief, misguided though it was, sustained him right up to the moment when the aircraft carrying him and his dreams fell burning from the Russian sky.